The city pulsed with life, its veins coursing with the icy grip of winter. The streets, bathed in the cold glow of flickering neon and harsh streetlights, were alive with movement. Cars speeding past in blurs of red and white. People wrapped in heavy coats, heads down, trudging forward in the relentless rhythm of survival. The world did not pause, did not care, did not notice. But for Jameer, a 15-year-old boy hardened by the unforgiving streets, the cold was more than just the bite of the wind against his skin. It was the weight of loneliness, of hunger, of the endless battle to exist in a world that had long since cast him aside. His coat, tattered and ill-fitting, hung loosely from his thin frame, its fabric barely enough to keep the chill at bay. His boots, their soles worn down to near nothing, slipped on the icy pavement as he moved through the city's maze of alleys and forgotten corners. He had learned long ago that survival depended on adaptability, on knowing where to hide, when to move, and how to make himself invisible. To the rest of the world he was just another shadow among the lost, another nameless figure swallowed by the indifference of the city. Tonight was no different. Hunger gnawed at his insides, but he ignored it, just as he ignored the cold biting at his fingers and the exhaustion creeping into his bones. He moved from alley to alley, his gaze sweeping over trash bins, searching for something, anything, that might ease the emptiness in his stomach. The wind howled between the buildings, and for a while, that was the only sound he heard, until something else cut through the night, a sound so soft, so fragile that at first he thought he had imagined it. A cry, faint, trembling. Jameer froze, his instincts sharpening, his breath catching in his throat. Sounds of distress were not uncommon in these streets, but there was something different about this. Something wrong. He strained his ears, and there it was again, a tiny, desperate whimper carried by the wind. His pulse quickened as he followed the sound, weaving through the labyrinth of discarded debris and crumbling walls, his steps careful, yet urgent. The closer he got, the clearer the cries became. His chest tightened with something unfamiliar. Was it fear? Number? It was something deeper, something urgent and unshakable. His fingers clenched around the frayed straps of his bag as he pushed forward, his breath coming out in small, frozen clouds. And then he saw it. A cardboard box, nearly buried beneath a mound of trash, tucked away in the darkest corner of the alley. The sound came from inside. For a moment, he hesitated. He had learned that curiosity was dangerous, that the city held secrets better left untouched. But the cry rang out again, weak, pleading. He could not walk away. Swallowing hard, he crouched down, his numb fingers shaking as he peeled back the damp flaps of the box. Inside, wrapped in a thin, soiled blanket, was a baby, tiny, fragile, trembling from the cold. Jameer's breath hitched in his throat. The infant's face was pale, her small fists barely strong enough to move as she whimpered softly, her cries growing weaker by the second. A cold, sharp dread gripped him. The baby was dying. His mind raced, but there was no time for questions, no time to wonder how or why. There was only one thing that mattered now. She needed warmth. She needed help. She needed someone to care. Without hesitation, Jameer reached into the box, his hands cradling the small, shivering form. Her skin was ice against his palms, and a chill ran through him, deeper than anything the winter wind could deliver. Holding her close, he pulled her into his chest, shielding her as best he could with his tattered coat. His heart pounded as he turned, his eyes darting around for any sign of help. But the streets were empty. No one was coming. No one cared, except him. Without another thought, he broke into a run. The cold air burned in his lungs as he sprinted through the empty streets, his boots barely finding traction on the frozen ground. The neon glow of a 24-hour convenience store flickered in the distance, and he pushed himself harder, his legs screaming in protest. He didn't stop until he burst through the doors, the warmth of the store hitting him like a wall. The clerk, a middle-aged man with weary eyes, looked up, startled. His gaze flickered from Jameer's panicked expression to the tiny bundle in his arms, and in an instant, he understood. Without hesitation, he grabbed the phone and called for an ambulance. Jameer could barely speak. His throat was dry, his chest heaving. He looked down at the baby, her small face still, her breaths faint. He held her tighter, his heart thundering as he willed her to hold on, to stay with him, to survive. Minutes passed in a blur, then sirens pierced the night. The paramedics arrived in a flurry of motion, their voices urgent as they took the baby from his arms, wrapping her in thick, warm blankets, checking for signs of life. Jameer stood frozen, his fingers still curled from where he had held her, his heart hammering in his chest. And then, just as they were loading her into the ambulance, he heard it. A soft, fragile cry. Alive. Relief crashed over him, so sudden and overwhelming that his knees nearly buckled. He had done something. He had saved her. But as the ambulance sped away, a new weight settled in his chest. Who had left her there? Why had she been abandoned? And now that she was gone, what was left for him? The cold wind howled through the streets once more, wrapping around him like an old, familiar ghost. He had saved her, but who would save him? Thornton Mansion, once a beacon of power and opulence, now felt desolate and empty, its lavish halls echoing with the silence of loss. Charles Thornton, a man whose empire stretched across vast landscapes, whose mere name instilled both admiration and fear, now stood crippled by an anguish no amount of wealth or influence could remedy. He had built his fortune with unwavering determination, yet in this moment none of it mattered. His world had unraveled in ways he never could have foreseen, leaving him drowning in the depths of helplessness. For weeks his wife, Lily, had clung to life, her fragile body trapped between existence and oblivion after a catastrophic car accident that had not only shattered bones, but also their very sense of joy. The doctors had spoken of progress, tentative, miraculous even, but just as hope had begun to take root, it was violently ripped away. A phone call, the kind no parent should ever receive, sent his world crumbling into dust. Their newborn son, Eli, was gone. The hospital, so preoccupied with saving Lily, had failed in the most unforgivable way. Somewhere in the chaos, in the flurry of medical urgency, someone had taken their son, stolen from the sterile safety of his hospital room, vanishing as if he had never existed. The abduction had been swift, too swift, raising suspicions among the staff. Yet, despite relentless questioning, security footage, and mounting desperation, there were no leads, no signs, no answers. Eli had disappeared without a trace, swallowed by the abyss of the unknown. Desperation clawed at Charles's insides, his grief morphing into a fierce, uncontrollable need to act. He did the only thing he could. He made an offer that would shake even the most hardened criminals, a sum of money so staggering, so obscene, that it could alter the course of any life. It was a desperate plea, a father's last resort, a cry into the void begging for his son's return. But as the days bled into weeks, the silence remained unbroken. Investigators combed through every possibility. The police pursued every shadow, and yet the city yielded nothing. Eli was gone, as if he had never been there at all. The mansion, once a testament to power and success, had transformed into a prison of sorrow. Its grand chandeliers cast cold, indifferent light upon the empty rooms. The air felt suffocating, thick with unspoken pain. Charles wandered the corridors like a ghost, tormented by memories of a life that had once been whole. His hands trembled as he traced the edges of a photograph, Lily, radiant even in exhaustion, holding their tiny son, her eyes filled with the unspoken promise of a future now stolen from them. He could no longer look at it without feeling his chest tighten, the pain almost unbearable. Lily remained in the hospital, physically mending yet mentally shattered. Though her body was slowly healing, her mind was trapped in the haze of medication and sorrow. When she stirred from her fog, she would ask for Eli, her voice fragile, her eyes filled with a hope that Charles could not bear to extinguish. Each time he hesitated, the words forming in his throat but never leaving his lips. How could he tell her? How could he shatter her completely when she was barely holding on? Instead, he swallowed the truth. his silence another burden pressing down on his already fractured soul. The helplessness was suffocating. For a man who had built his legacy through sheer will, through calculated moves and unshakable resolve, the inability to protect his own child was an agony beyond words. The search continued, but with each passing day, hope flickered like a dying flame. Would Lily ever fully wake? And if she did, would she still remember their son? Would she ever forgive him for failing to keep their child safe? Then, one evening, as Charles sat in his study, lost in the monotony of papers he barely registered, his assistant burst through the doors, his expression urgent, his breath uneven. "Sir, you need to see this," the man said, thrusting a newspaper into Charles's hands. With weary eyes, Charles took the paper, his fingers tightening as he scanned the bolded headline, "Heroic Teen Saves Abandoned Newborn Found on the Streets." The words sent a shock through his body, his pulse quickening. His mind, dulled by weeks of grief, suddenly sharpened, every sense on high alert. His eyes devoured the details. The report described a teenage boy named Jamir, a kid from one of the city's most impoverished neighborhoods, who had discovered an infant alone in a freezing alleyway, wrapped in nothing but a thin, dirty blanket. The baby had been on the brink of death, left to the mercy of the cold, until Jamir had taken him into his arms and rushed him to safety. Charles's heart pounded, his breath shallow. The timing, the circumstances, it was too much of a coincidence. Could this baby be Eli? Could his son, the child he had mourned, still be out there, alive? The desperation that had once turned into despair now ignited into something else, determination. He would not sit idly by any longer. He would find this boy, find this child. If there was even a sliver of hope that this newborn was Eli, he had to pursue it. And so the search began again, this time with renewed urgency. Charles Thornton was no longer just a grieving father. He was a man on a mission. The city's underbelly led him through paths he had never walked before, places he had only ever seen from the safe distance of his wealth. The investigation finally led him to a dilapidated building, the air thick with decay, the scent of damp wood and neglect wrapping around him like a ghostly presence. His breath misted in the frigid air as he stepped cautiously inside, his pulse hammering with every uncertain step. Then, in the dimly lit room at the end of the narrow hall, he saw them. Jamir, sitting on the cold, cracked floor, cradling the baby in his arms. The infant, swaddled in a worn, faded blanket, slept peacefully, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Charles's breath caught in his throat. His body tensed, torn between disbelief and overwhelming hope. Was this his son? For the first time in weeks, Charles felt something other than despair. It was fragile, almost dangerous to grasp onto, but it was there. Hope. Disbelief surged through Charles like a tidal wave, crashing against the very foundation of his reality. His son, his Eli, was alive. But the sight before him was something he never could have anticipated. There, in the dim light of an abandoned building, holding his child, stood a poor black teenager. His mind reeled with questions, suspicion threading through every thought, and the first words that broke free from his lips carried the weight of his unease. "Who are you?" Charles demanded, his voice sharp with accusation. His gaze darted between the boy and the baby, his fingers curling into fists as anger flared in his chest. "Why do you have my son? What the hell were you trying to do with him?" Jamir lifted his head, his expression steady despite the flicker of fear in his dark eyes. He knew who this man was. How could he not? The billionaire whose name graced countless headlines, the father of the child he had been protecting for days. But it wasn't the man's wealth or power that made him uneasy. It was what Charles might assume of him. "I wasn't trying to do anything, sir," Jamir said, his voice calm but carrying the slight tremble of uncertainty. "I found him. He was alone, abandoned on the street. I couldn't just walk away." His eyes softened as he glanced down at Eli, the child nestled against him. He needed someone. Charles took a menacing step forward, his expression a storm of fury and disbelief. You're telling me you just stumbled upon my son, lying helpless in the street?" His voice was thick with accusation, laced with something darker, mistrust, perhaps even fear. "And you expect me to believe that?" Jameer flinched at the intensity in Charles's tone, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had never been confronted like this, never had to defend something so pure, so selfless. Standing carefully, mindful not to wake the sleeping child, he lifted his chin, refusing to back down. "I wasn't looking for trouble," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I was just trying to survive, same as always. But when I saw him, I couldn't leave him there. I did what I thought was right. He deserved more than to be left out in the cold. Every child does." Charles's breath hitched, his mind spiraling with conflicting emotions. His world, one of opulence, control, and influence, had been shattered the moment Eli disappeared. And now, standing before him, was someone who had done what all his resources, his money, and his power had failed to do: find and protect his son. The realization unsettled him, pride and shame warring within. Then, a venomous whisper in his mind poisoned the moment. What if this boy was trying to take him? What if this was all a lie? Charles's jaw clenched. Enough. His voice was ice. He took another step forward, his presence towering over Jameer. "You stole my son, and you think you can just explain it away? I'm calling the police. You're going to regret this." Jameer's stomach twisted, but he held his ground, his arms instinctively tightening around Eli. He had sacrificed so much for this child, gone hungry so Eli wouldn't, endured sleepless nights to ensure he was safe. And now he was being treated like a criminal. "I didn't steal him," Jameer said, his voice shaking but fierce with conviction. "I saved him. If I hadn't, he wouldn't be here. You don't get to stand there and accuse me of something when you're only holding him now because of me." A tense silence fell over the room, thick with unspoken words. Charles stared at the boy before him, torn between his rage and the undeniable truth. His gaze dropped to Eli, who slept soundly in Jameer's arms, safe, unharmed, alive. Charles swallowed hard, the weight of his own guilt pressing down on him like a vice. "I never meant to hurt him," Jameer whispered, the vulnerability in his voice cutting through the tension. "I just wanted to keep him safe. No child deserves to be abandoned, no matter who they are." Charles's hardened features wavered, but before he could respond, a new voice, soft yet commanding, cut through the air. "Charles, what's going on?" All eyes turned to the doorway. Lily stood there, frail but standing, her presence shifting the atmosphere in an instant. Her gaze searched desperately until it landed on Eli. A sharp inhale left her lips as she reached for him, cradling him with trembling hands. Then, as if sensing the unspoken conflict in the room, her eyes locked onto Jameer. Recognition flickered. Understanding dawned, and in that moment she saw what Charles had refused to acknowledge. Her voice was gentle but firm. "This boy saved our son's life." She turned to Charles, her expression unwavering. "You should be thanking him, not accusing him." Charles exhaled sharply, his pride fighting against the undeniable truth. He had been so consumed by fear and anger that he had nearly destroyed the very thing he should have been grateful for. His grip on Eli loosened, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own misjudgment. And then, finally, he turned to Jameer, meeting his gaze with something new, something softer. "I was wrong," Charles admitted, the words tasting foreign yet liberating. "I was so blinded by my own pride that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. You didn't steal my son. You saved him." He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I owe you an apology." Jameer stood frozen, stunned. Never in his life had someone like Charles Thornton, someone with power, with wealth, offered him anything but indifference or suspicion. And yet, here he was, admitting he had been wrong. Then, Charles took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for the next words. "You changed everything for us, Jameer, and I want to change everything for you." He paused, his voice steady but laden with emotion. "I want to adopt you." Jameer's heart nearly stopped. The world around him blurred as he tried to process what he had just heard. "I want you to be my son," Charles continued, his voice thick with sincerity. "You deserve a future. You deserve everything I can give you. And more than that, you deserve to know that your worth isn't defined by where you came from, but by who you are." Tears stung the backs of Jameer's eyes, his breath hitching. His entire life, he had fought to survive. He had never expected anything from anyone. And yet, here was this man, who had once looked at him with nothing but suspicion, offering him a place in his family. Charles extended a hand. "Say yes. Let us give you the life you deserve." A breath, a heartbeat, a decision that would change everything. Jameer looked up, his voice unsteady but sure. "I accept." And just like that, his life shifted. Not because of luck or privilege, but because he had earned it. Because he had chosen love over fear, kindness over resentment. Because he had proven that true greatness was not measured by wealth or status, but by the size of one's heart.